Hi everyone, Tom Loria here. Welcome back to the shop. It's been a while since we've done a video, so I think it's about time we did one, and we're going to get away from rigging and rigging details, and we're going to take a look at the paint jobs that we put on our models. We'll examine some of the materials that we use, some of the methods that we use for applying that paint, and maybe a few tricks that you may not have thought about or may have heard about but haven't seen anybody do. So we'll give that a try. Stick with us. We're going to get into this right after a brief intro. Basically, we can break paints down into two categories: solvent-based and water-based. Most model builders I know have pretty much gone over to the water-based acrylics. Because of environmental restrictions placed on the manufacturers, the solvent-based colors are becoming less practical to produce and more difficult to dispose of when the time comes. So here I will pay a brief tribute to those paints that have produced such wonderful colors and finishes for so many years while joyously munching away on our brain cells. The two Flowquill products pictured here are basically brushing lacquer. Like the colors ground in Japan next to them, they've produced a dead flat finish, and, being lacquer, they dried quickly. Flowquill had its own solvent, which when it was available was quite expensive. As it became harder to find, I found lacquer thinner was an abundant and much less expensive substitute. The paints could be thinned to airbrush consistency and still give great coverage while obscuring none of the detail. It's interesting to note that a good amount of labeling space on both these products is given over to warnings and health risks. As sad as I might be about seeing these paints disappear, we are all literally breathing easier for it. Humbrol paints are produced in England, and the little pots that I have are more than 25 years old, and the paint is still completely usable. But I never really liked using them much because they have to be agitated constantly. They have to be thinned before they can be used, and they're very slow to dry. But that slow drying time also allowed the paint to level out very nicely, making it possible for a nearly brush-stroke-free finish. But by 1996, I had exhausted my stash of Flowquill and other solvent-based colors, and had to switch to Flowquill's new line of acrylics called Poly S. It was not love at first sight. The new paints did not flow off the brush or through the airbrush like the old paints. They didn't cover as well, making more coats necessary, and worst of all, they sanded horribly. But after a not-so-brief learning curve, I figured out how to handle the new material, and I became as adept at those paints as I had been with the lacquers, and being able to use water for cleanup was a great advantage. I also started using artists' acrylics, but these showed more promise as stains and washes and weathering paints rather than general model painting. It's also great for painting silkspan for sale material. As far as brushes go, I stay away from buying really expensive brushes. I'm a little too brutal on them for that. For the most part, I can get away with buying the economy packs at AC Moore or Michaels. I have only a few brushes you might consider good. But you can see from the selection that I have up here, it's pretty standard. Flats, angled, rounds, liners, and that big mop at the top of the frame is great for blending colors or doing fade-outs. I have a love-hate relationship with my airbrush. I love the finish a good airbrush produces, but I hate keeping it clean. I used to refinish furniture professionally, and in the spray booth, I hated dealing with keeping the spray equipment working properly. It was messy, time-consuming, and just a general pain in my ass. In the model shop, it's essentially the same story, just with smaller parts. I find it's a real disruption to the rhythm of the workflow to stop and clean an airbrush that's gotten clogged or bogged down. But unless you're an absolute master with a paintbrush, there's nothing else that produces that kind of finish. Here we have a few components for a 1/16 scale whaleboat. The grating is not for the whaleboat, and we will not be painting that piece in today's video. Mostly we'll be dealing with staining, weathering, and adding a bit of atmosphere to our models. And some of the parts are nearly finished, and some have a ways to go, so they will serve our purposes very nicely. I won't bother demonstrating standard painting techniques or dealing with airbrushes. There are plenty of videos out there for that. So let's get started. So here we are back in the shop. We're going to start with staining. And to do that, I'm going to use these artist acrylics here. A little bit of water and just some funky old brush. And this is going to illustrate a couple of things that happen whether you're staining or painting. I've got a raw piece of wood here. There's nothing on it. There's no shellac, no varnish, no sealer of any kind. It's just a plain piece of, in this case I think it's white holly. And if I wanted to make this into a hatch combing, or not a hatch combing, but a cockpit combing for a yacht or something along those lines, I'd want it stained fairly light so that it looks like oak, and I'd want it to have a sheen. And when we stain these things, we're going to stain them with these acrylic paints, and of course there's going to be quite a bit of water. And water has the effect, now I've sanded this nice and smooth, but as soon as I put water on here, all those nice little fibers of wood that are laying down so cooperatively right now are all going to stand up like they've just had a massive dose of Viagra. I guess you could say water is wood's Viagra. But we're going to show you how to deal with that, because you can't leave that alone. If you stain something and dries, you're going to have a lot of raised grain on it, and you really need to get rid of that. It's the simplest thing in the world to do. And in the case of our cockpit combing for our yacht, our Wiano Senior, or whatever it is we're making, when we get rid of that fur, all of that raised grain, it's going to have the added effect of actually burnishing the wood and putting a very soft sheen on it, which could look very much like a real, honest-to-goodness, varnished cockpit combing. So let's get started. And I'm just going to pick, we'll pick this color here, which is yellow oxide, and it's a very light yellow, especially when you dilute it down. So just a little bit of that. And I'm using dirty water here because it really doesn't matter. And we're going to use quite a bit of water and make a very thin, soupy paint, or stain in this case. So we're just going to brush this on. Oh, that's way too yellow. That's kind of sickly looking, isn't it? Alright, here's what we're going to do. We're going to add some burnt, oh, I thought this was burnt sienna. This is burnt umber. That's okay. This is basically a reddish brown. It's fairly dark. And we're going to add some of this to tone down this yellow, because that's really awful. You can see I'm not being incredibly scientific about this. You might say that that's a little too dark, but we're going to wipe off the excess and see what happens with it. Alright, so this is a very thin piece of wood. It's probably, looks like it's probably about 15 or 16 thousandths of an inch thick, and that bit of water has made it cup. So maybe we'll do both sides and see if we can get it to cup around the other way too. Probably not, but that's okay. This is just a demonstration. Alright, So now, that nice homogeneous looking piece of wood has now got, well, it hasn't got the grain raised too badly, but it's not great. So what I would normally do is let this dry, and I will let it dry and I'll move on to something else. And then we're going to burnish it down. We're going to burnish off that fur. But let's move on. Let's take those two things. Those are two paddles from the whaleboat model. Now they've been stained, and right now they don't look all that appetizing. As a matter of fact, this one I can feel has got raised grain on it. So obviously I stained this one and then never burnished it down. Not that big a deal on this particular piece, because this is a particular piece. First of all, when it's on the model, you'll probably see maybe that much of it. Maybe. Depending on where on the model it is. There are 6 of these that go on the model, and they're all in different spots, and they're very low visibility. But this is a great opportunity to demonstrate the difference between what a raised grain surface looked like and something that's been burnished down, and then we can weather it if we want. So this was stained a long time ago. This feels rough, this feels rough, that feels pretty rough. And all you do is you take a piece of paper towel and you just rub. There's absolutely no technique to this. It's just rubbing the piece of wood. And as you rub, I can see it here. I don't know if it's going to show up on the camera, but I can see that there's already a sheen developing. Now, this is a piece for a working boat, and a working boat would definitely not have anything with a shipshape and Bristol fashion on it, fashion finished on it. So we're going to have to get rid of that sheen. But what that sheen indicates is that, yes, I have gotten rid of the fur that's been caused by putting the water-based stain on it, and now I've got a nice smooth finish. On the model, if you leave that, the whole model will have an overall look of being furry, for lack of a better word. It will just look rough, not unfinished, but unkempt, uncared for, unseen to. And that sort of takes people out of the illusion that they're actually looking at a real vessel instead of a model, because the finish will look too big. The surface texture will look too big for the piece that this is representing. So now we've got a nice smooth surface, and we're going to add some texturing and weathering. Not texturing, weathering and wear. This is a piece that's, let's say it's been on the whaleboat, I don't know, maybe 6 months or a year, so it's been exposed to the weather all that time, and it's definitely going to be grayed out. It's not going to be that nice wood color. So let's see, we want some black and white, and we want some of that burnt sienna again. Okay, so I don't know if this is in the frame or not, but I'm putting small amounts of black, white, and maybe either some burnt sienna or some burnt umber into my little mixing dishes here. So now, what I'm going to do is first mix up just a plain old gray with maybe more white than black. And I just painted my finger too. Cool. Okay, I'm not going to be too careful about the consistency of the color because we are going to put this on in such small amounts that color inconsistencies will never show up. And now this technique is a page right out of plastic modelers' books and railroad modelers. They love to use weathering, they love to use dry brushing, and that's what we're doing here. I'm not using any water to thin this out. I want the paint full thickness, which is kind of pasty. A little bit on the ends of the brush, on the bristles, and then most of what's on the brush is going to be taken off. Now thinking about what it is we're doing here, so there would be two places where there would be hand wear. And we can either go one of two ways with the hand wear here. We can either go dark, like your dirty hands have grabbed this many times and left a couple of soil spots on the handle, or we can go the other way where it's worn off the finish. I think we're going to go with the dirty spots. And all you do is you start, and you don't think you're doing anything. And maybe I've talked so long that the paint is totally dried up. Yeah, it has. Okay. Let's take some of this umber. Probably about here, I'm guessing at this, would be the second spot. Now another thing that's probably not showing up on the camera, but this is another effect that happens when you use this dry brushing, is anywhere where the actual surface is got deviations in it, and this does, it's got deviations along its grain. The higher spots are going to pick up the color, the lower spots are going to avoid it. So not only do we have the dirt spots that you can see, we've also got some grain standing out. And again, I don't know if you can see that, whether it's showing up. I'll take a photograph of this, a close-up photograph, and put this up on the screen with the process. And there we have the two hand marks. So what else would happen with this? It's exposed to salt and spray and water and whale oil and blood and everything that it comes in contact with during the course of its trade. So we have to add a few things here and there in the cracks and crevices where they might gather. So here it's already started, but certainly not enough. Now with any of this stuff, you just saw me make a mistake there. I put too much on right there. But we can play that down, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute, because this is not the end of the tune here. After we get done with this, there's one more step to do. Now, of course, this is all subjective. This is your world you're creating here. I know I'm starting to sound like Bob Ross. Maybe in our world, there's a little bit of grime lives right there. Yeah. All right. And maybe that's enough. Now, the last step is to make a wash to tone all this down to make it look like you're looking at it from some sort of a distance. And that's going to involve taking maybe that gray paint that I mixed up earlier for the dry brushing and making a lot of water, or putting a lot of water in there and making a kind of a grayish brown slurry. Now, let's see. Right back. Okay, so let's put a gray wash on this, and the wash is going to tone everything down and sort of, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh my God, what's he doing? But have a little faith. Okay, so two things we can do. We can either wipe some of this off, or I can get the hairdryer and force dry it. And I think I will probably wind up doing both. Alright, let's see what we have here. Does it look convincing? Maybe. So now, I got a real holiday there, so I gotta get rid of that. Now, as far as choosing a brush to do this dry brushing with, I'm really not using a proper brush for this right now. But what you should strive for in a good dry brushing brush is something with short bristles. It can't be too terribly stiff, and the bristles have to be fairly close together. I mean, you can't take something that's got, you know, a low bristle count. You can't take a thin brush. It has to be fairly thick, because it's got to be able, you've got to be able to flip it back and forth over the surface like that. It's got to be able to do that, and it's got to get rid of the paint. It's got to transfer that paint onto your piece, whatever that is. So this brush is a little too soft, and the bristles are a little too long, but for right now it's what I've got in my hand, so I'm going to use it. And you can use it. You can be successful with it. It just takes a little bit more work. So here, now, I think that looks a little better. Look at that. And again, I'll take close-up photographs of all of this stuff, anything that we do today. I'll take close-up photographs of it so that you can actually see the texture and the weathering and the variations and the subtleties. So there you have it. So let's move on to a little bit more weathering. And the whole trick to weathering, or imparting atmosphere, or imparting wear, or implying wear, is realizing what the thing is used for, how it's going to be used, and then you adjust your methods and techniques accordingly. Here we have the wave pole. So this was stuck into the whale, usually down to the point somewhere below the blubber, which was generally about 18 inches. This piece, and it's right here, we're looking at, I think this is about 8 or 9 feet. So that first 1.5 or 2 feet would be the part that would be stuck in the whale. Clearly, that's going to get a lot more wear than this part up here, which would just be exposed to the air. These things were kept in the bottom of the boat, so they would have been rolling around. They would have been exposed to a lot of seawater, because there was always water in the bottom of the boats. They might just turn completely black over time, especially if they were oak. Oak has a tendency to turn just about totally black. But we're not going to take it that far. Truthfully, I'm not crazy about using these for solid paints as, you know, as a method for painting your model. But that's just me. I'm sure that there are guys out there. As a matter of fact, I know the whole idea of using artist colors came to me through Eric Ronberg in an article that he wrote many years ago, probably at least 25, maybe even 30 years ago, about how he used artist colors on his models. His models are gorgeous. Clearly, he's found a way to work with these successfully. Me, not so much. So I use them mostly for staining, weathering, and atmosphere. And of course, as I said earlier too, for silk span. It's great for painting silk span. So there we've got our stained wood. And this. Okay. Now, this brush right here, which has clearly had a long and productive life, is about the perfect brush for dry brushing. It's got short bristles, they're fairly stiff, which you want, and there's quite a few of them. I know it doesn't look like a lot on the camera, but there's enough here so that you can keep the paint charged up at the ends of the bristles, and it will transfer fairly easily. So, let's get this done. So, start with some fairly dark gray for this one. And take off the excess, and just irrigate pretty liberally. But as you get further up, it'll be a lot more simple. Give the whole thing a gray wash coat, just the same way we did with the paddle earlier. So that's really about it. I mean, you could carry this on, but there's really no need. As a matter of fact, we're going to make this even a darker gray for the wash. We're going to put more black in it. Because this is just a little too bright, I think. Sort of mentioned about Ross earlier, but I was not talking at all. I have a great respect about and believe about Ross, and it's because again I learned his colors, and sometimes when my son's small, we use to watch that paint every afternoon on a local PS station. And it was through him that I learned to analyze and mix colors. So I owe a great debt to the very sweet guy. Okay, so there, got my triangle. So there we have. So there we've got a wave pole. Now those two hot spots down there look a little too obvious. They probably would have been a little bit more blended in. Do I have any paint left here? Oh yes, oh yes. So now, there we go, that's better. There. Okay, so here we've got a couple of wave poles in various stages of weathering and a couple of paddles. Now, when I was gathering the parts to do this video, I came upon some other parts for a whaleboat, and I want to show those to you because it sort of illustrates a really good point about how far to take this stuff. One of the things that I've noticed about a lot of railroad guys is when they do the weathering thing, it's like they're in both feet and up to the neck. That's not, I think, always the best approach to doing this. Sometimes subtler is better. These parts here that you see are at 1/16 scale. That's 3/4 of an inch to the foot. That's a pretty big scale. Here are those same 8 or 9 foot wave poles at 1/64th scale, or 3/64ths to the foot. There are the paddles. So here you've got paddles and wave poles. Here you've got a cutting in spade, and you've got the same cutting in spade. This scale requires almost no, this is just not necessary at that scale. To be looking at this part at that scale, if that were a real boat, you'd be like about 100 feet away from it. You wouldn't see the weathering at that point, so no sense in putting it on. There is a little bit on here, but it has more to do with the fact that the stain was just taken into the wood in an uneven way rather than me purposely going to weather it. As a matter of fact, I didn't weather it. You know, here's I don't have a hatchet at this scale, but here's the hatchet for the 1/16th, or the 1/16 whaleboat. And I don't know if you can see it. And again, I'll put up photos of all this stuff, close-ups. Here I've worn away the stain where the hands would grip. Here there's an accumulation of crud. The axe head, the hatchet head, would have been painted red or black or something. And that I can actually put some, that could stand a little dulling down. That's a little too bright and a little too much like red paint. Doesn't look like it's been out in the world very long. But you have to think about where it was used, how it was used, and weather accordingly. When used correctly, this technique could add enough visual interest to your model that the viewer will find himself or herself lingering to take it all in. And if that happens, they will make the connection between that seemingly inanimate windlass and the people who had to make it work. Or they might look at the worn treads on the ladder leading down into the cabin of the fishing schooner and wonder about its inhabitants. Who lived there? Did they love what they did? Or was it just the best choice for them? Were they lost at sea? Or did they make it out of this life alive and go to work on some farm far from the ocean? If your viewers start asking questions, then your model has become something more than just a project you started for your own enjoyment. It has become a window into a world that many of us never get the chance to see. Whether hobbyist or professional, our work does create an impression. It's our charge to convey as real an image as our knowledge and our skills allow. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if there's something you were hoping to see and didn't, please let me know in the comments down below. And please remember to hit the like and the subscribe button and the notification button. That's the little bell near the top right of the page. So until next time, break's over. Back into the shop.